Hey, Farid here from the Rational Farid. All right, let me ask you something. The New Testament books of Luke and Acts, pretty foundational stuff for a lot of folks, right? Presented as these solid historical accounts of Jesus and the birth of the early church, we're told they come from reliable sources, maybe even eyewitnesses, divine inspiration, the whole 9 yards. But what if I told you there's a pretty massive historical curveball hidden in plain sight? What if the author behind Luke and Acts wasn't just relying on holy whispers or what Peter and Paul remembered? What if they were, let's say, peeking over the shoulder of another major historian of the time? And not just peeking, but maybe borrowing. A lot? Yeah. We're talking about the possibility that the writer of nearly a quarter of the New Testament used the works of the famous Jewish historian Flavius Josephus as a major source, like a human source for some of the Bible's most pivotal history. Now hold on. Before you think I'm just stirring the pot for kicks, and hey, sometimes that's fun too. This isn't some wild, out of left field theory I cooked up. This is something serious scholars have been wrestling with, and the evidence? It's fascinating. We're not talking about vague similarities here. We're talking about specific names, events, even peculiar little errors that start to look really suspicious when you put Luke-Acts side by side with Josephus. So if you've ever wondered how these ancient texts actually came together, or if you're curious about a historical puzzle that could radically shift when we think Luke and Acts were written, and by whom, then you need to see this. Because today we're diving deep into the clues, the glitches in the matrix, if you will, that suggest a direct link. This isn't just about academic debate, team. This is about understanding the very foundations of narratives that have shaped history. So grab your thinking caps, maybe a coffee, because by the end of this, you might just look at the New Testament in a whole new light. Let's get into it. Okay, so how do we even begin to untangle something like this? It's not like we're going to find a little note scribbled in the margins of an ancient scroll saying, "Yo, borrowed this bit from Joe." That'd be convenient. But history, especially ancient history, rarely hands us a smoking gun on a silver platter. When we, as critical thinkers and historians, look at ancient texts, we're not usually expecting some single knockout piece of proof that settles the matter beyond all shadow of a doubt. It's more like detective work, honestly. We're piecing together clues, weighing probabilities, and trying to find the most logical and best explanation for all the available evidence. Think of it like assembling a massive ancient jigsaw puzzle where maybe half the pieces are missing, and the picture on the box is pretty faded. You look for patterns, for edges that fit, for the most coherent image you can build. Now, one of the biggest clues in this kind of textual investigation is what scholars call striking overlaps, or significant parallels. And I need to be clear here. When I say striking, I don't just mean that both Luke-Acts and Josephus mention, say, Jerusalem, or talk about Romans and Jews. That's like saying two books about World War II both mention soldiers. Duh! Of course they do. That's just common background. A striking overlap is when you find unique combinations of specific details, particular names appearing in a certain context, unusual turns of phrase, or distinct characterizations that show up together in only these two sets of writings, Luke-Acts and Josephus, and pretty much nowhere else in the vast ocean of ancient literature from that period. It's like this. Imagine two people are describing the same really chaotic street festival. If they both say it was crowded and noisy, well, no big deal. But if they both specifically mention a guy juggling flaming chickens while riding a unicycle and a dog that snatched a string of sausages from a particular vendor, and those aren't details anyone else seems to have noted, you'd start to seriously wonder, right? Did one of them see the other's account? Or did they both get their info from the same, very specific, perhaps slightly eccentric observer? Those kinds of oddly specific, shared details, appearing in a similar way or sequence, that's the stuff that makes historians lean in and say, that's not likely to be a random coincidence. It suggests a connection that's much harder to dismiss, and it's these kinds of overlaps we're about to dive into. All right, so we've established that we're looking for those peculiar shared details that scream connection rather than coincidence. So what are some of these alleged striking overlaps between Luke-Acts and the works of Josephus? Let's get into the juicy bits. One of the most discussed examples comes from a speech in the book of Acts, chapter 5. There's a respected Pharisee named Gamaliel, and he's trying to convince the Sanhedrin not to persecute the early apostles. To make his point, he basically says, hey, let these guys alone. If their movement is just human, it'll fizzle out, just like other movements did. But if it's from God, you can't stop it. And then he gives examples of failed rebel leaders. Pay attention to these names. First, Gamaliel in Acts mentions a guy named Theudas. He says Theudas claimed to be somebody, gathered about 400 men, was killed, and his followers were scattered. Poof, movement over. Then Gamaliel says, after Theudas came Judas the Galilean. This Judas, according to Acts, appeared during the days of the census, led a revolt, also perished, and his followers were dispersed. And later in Acts chapter 21, we get another interesting mention. The apostle Paul is arrested, and the Roman commander mistakes him for someone else. He asks Paul, aren't you the Egyptian who recently stirred up a revolt and led 4,000 Sicarii? Those are like extremist assassins or daggermen, out into the wilderness. Now here's where it gets really interesting. These specific figures, Theudas, Judas the Galilean, and this Egyptian rebel associated with the Sicarii, aren't just pulled out of thin air. They also feature in the extensive historical writings of, you guessed it, Flavius Josephus. Josephus gives accounts of these individuals. He talks about Judas the Galilean and his connection to the census and the resistance movement. He describes a figure named Theudas, who led a popular movement and was executed. And he details the story of an Egyptian false prophet who gathered followers, including Sicarii, and had a confrontation with the governor Felix. The key thing here, folks, isn't just that these names appear in both, it's the specific cluster and the way they are presented as examples of failed messianic figures or rebels. Out of all the dozens, maybe hundreds, of minor rebel leaders, prophets, and troublemakers from that chaotic period of Judean history, why these particular ones brought up in Acts? And why do their brief mentions in Acts align so curiously with figures that Josephus, in his much larger histories, also chose to highlight and describe, sometimes with similar characterizations or contexts, like the Sicarii linked to the Egyptian? It starts to look less like two independent authors randomly plucking the exact same, relatively minor historical figures from a vast pool of possibilities, and more like one author might have had access to the other's curated list. This combination is pretty unique in ancient literature to just these two sources. That's a pretty big flag for historical detectives. But it gets even more specific, and this is where we move from just overlaps to potential errors that are very revealing. So we've seen these striking overlaps, this curious cluster of names, Theudas, Judas the Galilean, the Egyptian. Now, does that automatically mean the author of Luke-Acts was sitting there with a copy of Josephus, like literally cribbing notes? For a long time, many scholars actually lean towards a different explanation, the common source theory. The idea was, okay, maybe both Luke-Acts and Josephus were drawing their information from some other historical document, a source that's now lost to us. And you can see why that was an attractive idea. While there are these undeniable similarities we've talked about, there are also differences. Sometimes the details vary, and crucially, sometimes the chronology, the order of events, seems a bit different between the two. So a common source could, in theory, explain both the similarities and the discrepancies if both authors were independently selecting and perhaps slightly altering material from it. But, and this is a big but, here's where the plot thickens. This is where the evidence, in my view, and that of a growing number of critical scholars, starts to point much more convincingly towards the author of Luke-Acts, directly using Josephus's writings as a source. And ironically, it's not just the similarities, but the nature of the differences, specifically certain errors, or as I like to call them, glitches in the matrix within Luke-Acts, that actually make the strongest case for this direct borrowing. These are mistakes that make a whole lot more sense if someone is reading and perhaps misunderstanding or adapting Josephus, rather than if both are using some accurate hypothetical common source. Let's take a classic example, Lysanias. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 3, verse 1, when it's setting the scene for John the Baptist, it lists the contemporary rulers, and it mentions Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, as being in power around, say, 29 CE. Sounds specific, right? But when you go to Josephus, he consistently refers to the area called the Tetrarchy of Lysanias. He talks about this territory being granted to King Agrippa IV by the Roman emperors Caligula and Claudius, which happened much later. In the late 30s and early 40s CE, decades after Luke has this Lysanias supposedly ruling. Josephus isn't talking about a ruler named Lysanias active in 29 CE. He's referring to a geographical region that used to be associated with a much earlier Lysanias, who died way back in 36 BCE, far too early for John the Baptist's time. It looks a lot like the author of Luke-Acts saw Josephus mention the Tetrarchy of Lysanias in passages discussing Agrippa the Piaxo, and basically thought, oh, okay, so there was a ruler named Lysanias back around the time of John the Baptist. They seem to have misunderstood Josephus's geographical reference concerning a later period as meaning there was a contemporary ruler by that name during John's ministry. This kind of specific, slightly odd historical hiccup makes perfect sense if Luke-Acts was reading Josephus and made a small interpretive leap. It's a much stranger error if both were drawing from some pristine, accurate common source that somehow Luke messed up. But Josephus got right regarding this specific point. Okay, now for an even bigger one. Remember Theudas and Judas the Galilean from Gamaliel's speech in Acts? This one is a kicker. In Acts chapter 5, Gamaliel clearly presents the order of these rebels as first Theudas, then Judas the Galilean. For before these days Theudas rose up. After him Judas the Galilean rose up. Pretty straightforward. But hold on to your hats. Josephus, who gives us detailed accounts of both these figures, has a completely different timeline. Josephus tells us Judas the Galilean led his revolt in connection with the census under Quirinius, way back around 6 CE, and Theudas. Josephus places Theudas's uprising much, much later, during the time when Fadus was procurator of Judea, which was in the mid-40s CE, around 44 to 46 CE. Now think about this. Gamaliel's speech in Acts is set historically well before the mid-40s CE, probably in the early 30s CE. So how could Gamaliel, speaking in the early 30s, possibly mention Theudas, whose revolt, according to Josephus, wouldn't even happen for another decade or more? And how could he get the order so dramatically wrong, putting the later Theudas before the earlier Judas? This chronological blunder in Acts is a massive red flag. It makes very little sense if the author of Acts had reliable, independent historical knowledge or was using some accurate common source. But it makes perfect sense if the author of Luke-Acts was writing much later, perhaps with Josephus's Antiquities, published around 93 CE, open in front of them, saw these two names of notable failed rebels, and simply got them jumbled, or perhaps deliberately reordered them for their own narrative purposes, not being too concerned about the precise historical sequence from Josephus's detailed account. It's like someone pulling names from a history book and getting the timeline mixed up. So these glitches, like misinterpreting Lysanias as a contemporary ruler and, even more significantly, getting the Theudas-Judas timeline spectacularly backwards in a way that's historically impossible for the character Gamaliel within the narrative of Acts. These are far better explained by the author of Luke-Acts borrowing from, and at times misinterpreting or adapting, Josephus. These aren't the kinds of errors you'd expect if both were independently using some unknown, accurate common source. If anything, these specific types of errors strengthen the case for direct literary dependence on Josephus. And this, as you might imagine, has some pretty big implications, particularly for when we think Luke-Acts was actually written. Okay, so we've waded through the overlaps, the striking parallels, and those telling glitches in the matrix like the Lysanias issue and the Theudas-Judas timeline flip. You might be sitting there thinking, all right, Farid, that's some interesting historical detective work, a nice textual puzzle. But so what? What's the actual big deal here? Why does this really matter? Well, the so what is massive. It's a game changer, especially when it comes to one of the most fundamental questions about any historical document. When was it actually written? Here's the crucial piece of information that ties all of this together. Flavius Josephus, our historian in question, published his major work, the Antiquities of the Jews. That's the book containing many of these specific details we've discussed, like the fuller accounts of Judas the Galilean and the census, the story of Theudas, and those references to Lysanias as a place name. He published this work around the year 93 CE. Give or take a year, but that date, 93 CE, is a pretty solid anchor point in history. So, if the author of Luke and Acts was indeed using Josephus's Antiquities as a source for these details, and the evidence we've looked at strongly points in that direction, then there's a very straightforward and, frankly, unavoidable logical conclusion. Luke-Acts had to have been written after 93 CE. You can't copy from a book or be influenced by its specific content and errors if that book hasn't even been written and published yet, right? It's basic cause and effect. Now, why is this such a bombshell? Because this conclusion completely rocks the traditional timeline for when Luke-Acts was written. Many traditional views, the kind you might hear in Sunday school or from more conservative commentators, place the writing of Luke's Gospel in the book of Acts much, much earlier. Often they're attributed to a guy named Luke, supposedly a physician and a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul. And based on that, these books are often dated somewhere in the 60s CE, maybe the early 70s at a stretch. The idea is that they were written by someone who was relatively close to the events, or at least close to the first generation of Jesus' followers. But if Luke-Acts is using material from Josephus that was published in 93 CE, then we're not talking about the 60s or 70s anymore. We are catapulting the composition of these foundational New Testament books well into the late 1st century, or more probably into the early 2nd century. We could be talking about a date around 100 CE, 110 CE, maybe even a bit later for the final form of Luke-Acts. That's a shift of decades, potentially an entire generation or more. This doesn't just change a date on some dusty academic chart. It fundamentally alters our perception of these texts. It means Luke-Acts is likely not a near contemporary account penned by an eyewitness or a close associate of Paul who was in the know. Instead, it positions Luke-Acts as a later, more consciously literary and historical composition, likely written by an anonymous, educated author who is looking back at events from a greater distance and using available written sources, including the works of a prominent historian like Josephus, to construct their narrative of Jesus and the early Christian movement. That's a profound difference in how we understand the origins, the nature, and the historical reliability of nearly a quarter of the New Testament. So, we've established a strong case that the author of Luke-Acts was using Josephus. We've seen the overlaps, the telltale errors that point to literary dependence, and the massive implication this has for dating these New Testament books much later. Now, the next big question that probably pops into your head is, why? Why would the author of Luke-Acts do this? Was it just intellectual laziness? Were they trying to pull a fast one? Well, to answer that, we really need to step out of our 21st century mindset about things like plagiarism or even how history was written and understood back then. Ancient authors, especially those writing these kinds of blended historical theological narratives, often had different priorities and operated under different conventions than modern historians who are obsessed with pinpoint accuracy and meticulously citing every single source. Their primary goal wasn't always to produce a just the facts, ma'am academic treatise. They were often trying to tell a compelling story, make a theological argument, build up their community, or persuade an audience. And one absolutely standard, recognized way to give your own work a sense of gravitas, credibility, and authority, especially if you were writing sometime after the events you're describing, was to show that you were well-read and that your account was consistent with known historical details. Now think about it. If you're an educated person writing in the late 1st or more likely early 2nd century, and your narrative touches on Judean history, the political landscape, various sects, and Roman governance in the region, who was the go-to guy? Who was the most well-known and comprehensive historian of Jewish affairs, the Jewish war, and the whole backstory? It was Flavius Josephus. His works, particularly the Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews, were significant historical accounts available to the educated public. For many, he was the authority. So, by weaving in names, events, and specific details that an educated reader might recognize from or associate with a renowned historian like Josephus, even if those details were sometimes slightly altered, reordered, or misunderstood, like we saw with Theudas and Lysanias, the author of Luke-Acts could subtly bolster their own narrative's credibility. It wasn't necessarily about plagiarism in our modern negative sense, but more about using established literary techniques to lend authority and verisimilitude to their own unique message and story. It was a way to make their narrative appear well-informed and historically plausible to their intended audience. So, when we cut through the noise and the layers of tradition, and just follow the textual and historical breadcrumbs, those uniquely shared names like Theudas, Judas the Galilean, and the Egyptian, those curious chronological glitches with Lysanias, or the impossible timing in Gamaliel's speech, the evidence really does start to stack up. It strongly suggests that the anonymous author of the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts was familiar with and drew upon the historical works of Flavius Josephus. And that, as we've discussed, isn't just some minor academic quibble, it's a big deal. It means these foundational New Testament texts were likely written much later than many traditional views claim, probably after 93 CE, pushing them well into the late 1st, or more likely the early 2nd century. This challenges the idea that they were penned by a direct companion of Paul or someone extremely close to the original events, and instead points to a later author, carefully constructing a narrative using available historical and literary sources, just like other writers of their time. Ultimately, this is what critical historical analysis looks like: examining the evidence, weighing probabilities, and being open to where that evidence leads, even if it challenges long-held assumptions. It's a fascinating glimpse into how these incredibly influential ancient texts were actually put together, with human hands, using human sources. So, what do you think about all this? Does this perspective change how you view Luke-Acts or the New Testament in general? I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. Drop your comments down below. Let's get a good, rational discussion going. If you learned something new today, or if this video got your brain buzzing, do me a huge favor and smash that like button. It really helps the channel out. Share this video with anyone you think might find it interesting or provocative. And of course, if you haven't already, and you want more deep dives into history, religion from a skeptical perspective, and all things critical thinking, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ding the notification bell so you don't miss out on future content from the Rational Farid. Thanks so much for watching. It's been a wild ride through ancient history today. As always, stay curious and stay rational. I'll catch you in the next video.